This thing that he's doing where he's pretending that he's a woman is very smart.
It really don't make a difference if you say he or she to me.
Some psychopath can just pretend that they're a woman and knock women over on the court.
I gotta take this out.
Norman's a fucking woman, dude. I bet.
Oh,
It's a giant dude. A giant dude who's just dominating these chicks. So the more controversy there is, the more people do come to see them. The crazy thing about the WNBA, imagine if the NBA had the same sexual dynamic. Imagine if the most of the team was a bunch of gay dudes who were like very aggressive and black.
Women's sports just hit a breaking point, and nobody in charge seems to care. Joe Rogan sat down in front of millions of listeners and said out loud what a huge portion of the country has been thinking quietly for years. And the moment he did, the WNBA found itself standing at the edge of a cliff it built with its own hands.
If you can't define what a woman is, then you're an idiot, and this is nonsense. And that's what your ideology is. Your ideology is so stupid, you can't define the difference between a male and a female. And so you've decided that people identifying with something means it's a real thing, and you have to say it because everybody else says it, and they scare you, and they'll cancel you and go after you. So everyone's agreed to nonsense. So this is where we painted ourselves into this dumb app.
BRITTNey Griner stepped into the spotlight and declared that biological men deserve a place in women's sports. Sophie Cunningham pushed back and immediately got dragged through the mud for it. And somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, Clark is breaking records, filling arenas, and single-handedly keeping the league relevant, while the people running it seem determined to burn everything down. This isn't just a sports debate anymore. It's a full-scale war over what women's sports actually means, who gets to compete, who gets to speak, and who gets silenced for telling the truth.
So when someone like BRITTNey Griner says, actually, I'm going to fight for men to play in women's sports, it's just another blow against lots of young female athletes.
But they've painted themselves in a corner, because if they don't let the guy in, it looks bad.
Right.
But if they do, he's going to dunk.
Well, the thing is, can you define what a woman is? And until you can't, if you can't define what a woman is, then you're an idiot. And this is nonsense.
The WNBA's front office is scrambling. The media is choosing sides. And the fans? They're watching all of it very carefully. Here's everything that's happening, why it matters, and what nobody in the mainstream is willing to say out loud. Long before the WNBA became the battleground it is today, Joe Rogan was already sounding the alarm. His concern didn't start with basketball, it started in the cage. As one of the most recognized voices in MMA commentary, Rogan watched firsthand as biological males who had transitioned began competing against biological females in combat sports. What he saw disturbed him deeply, not because of any personal animosity, but because the physical mismatch was impossible to ignore. Women were getting hurt. Careers were being ended, and the people in charge were either cheering it on or staying deliberately silent. That experience planted a seed that eventually grew into one of the most explosive sports commentaries of the year. When Rogan brought the WNBA into his crosshairs on a recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, he didn't hold back.
The things that Joe Rogan, a prominent podcast, one of the things that made him wake up to this issue is he's an MMA fighter.
Correct.
And when Joe Rogan saw biological males who are transitioning to female beating the hell out of biological females in the ring, he started to think,
What are we doing?
What are we doing here? Like, why are we cheering this on?
If you say anything like, look, trans women aren't women. There are men who identify as women, which is fine, but there's a biological distinction that protects women in sports, and that's chromosomes. We know XX chromosome, you're a woman, XY, you're a dude. Do it that way. Call yourself whatever the fuck you want. But if you want to play in the WNBA, you have to have XX.
He described the situation with a bluntness that his audience has come to expect, calling out what he saw as an absurd institutional failure, one where organizations have tied themselves into such a tight ideological knot that they can no longer even define the basic terms at the center of the debate. His argument was simple and delivered without apology. If you cannot define what a woman is, the entire framework of women's sports collapses. And in his view, that's exactly what's happening right now. What made Rogan's commentary land so hard wasn't just the words, it was the platform behind them. The Joe Rogan Experience consistently pulls in tens of millions of listeners per episode, dwarfing the viewership of most cable sports networks combined. When Rogan speaks about a topic, it doesn't stay contained to a podcast bubble. It bleeds into mainstream conversation almost immediately, forcing media outlets, league executives, and athletes to respond whether they want to or not. That's exactly what happened here. Rogan laid out what he called the only logical solution to the debate: chromosome testing. XX, you compete in women's sports. XY, you don't. No gray area, no ideological flexibility, no exceptions. He framed it as the one standard that respects both science and fairness simultaneously, arguing that an individual can identify however they choose in their personal life without that identity automatically granting access to female athletic competition. The distinction between personal identity and biological classification, in his view, is not cruel, it's necessary. He also took direct aim at what he described as the corner that sports organizations have painted themselves into. By adopting policies driven by social pressure rather than biological science, leagues have created a situation where any pushback against those policies gets labeled as hateful, even when the pushback comes from female athletes trying to protect their own careers.
Doesn't the WNBA have an onus of responsibility to be able to ensure that it's fair playership, though? I don't know if playership's a word.
For college sports and for the WNBA, too, 100%. I mean, I don't think it's ever okay for guys to be playing girl sports, but if this is true, then she was like the origin of this epidemic.
Mostly big black gay ladies and a few scared-looking Sophie Cunninghams that have to point fingers at people. I mean, you're surrounded by people who think you're perhaps sexually attractive.
They've made it into a reality show. It's become like Real Housewives. They're all just fight now.
Right.
That's the only reason you watch.
But it is an interesting sexual dynamic.
Rogan called it a collective agreement to accept nonsense, one maintained not by genuine belief, but by fear of cancellation. The segment went viral almost instantly. Clips spread across social media platforms within hours, racking up millions of views and igniting comment sections that reflected a deeply divided public. Supporters called it the most honest sports commentary they'd heard in years. Critics accused Rogan of being reductive and dangerous. But regardless of which side you landed on, one thing was undeniable. The conversation was happening now, louder than ever, and there was no putting it back in the box. What nobody expected was who would step forward next to make it even messier. To understand why this debate is hitting the WNBA so hard right now, you have to understand the position the league was already in before any of this started. For years, the WNBA operated in the shadow of financial uncertainty. Attendance numbers were inconsistent. Television ratings struggled to compete with other professional leagues. Sponsorship deals were modest compared to what the NBA was pulling in. The league survived, but it was never truly thriving, and everyone inside it knew it. During that period of financial fragility, league leadership made a calculated bet. They leaned hard into progressive political identity as a branding strategy. Social justice messaging became central to the WNBA's public image. Players were encouraged to speak on political issues, and the league positioned itself as a leader in advocacy rather than purely in athletics. For a segment of the audience, this was deeply appealing. For another segment, it was a complete turnoff, and the ratings reflected that split in uncomfortable ways. The strategy created an internal tension that has never fully resolved. On one side, you had players and executives who genuinely believed in the political mission and saw the league as a vehicle for social change. On the other side, you had players, fans, and observers who wanted the focus to stay on basketball. That tension simmered quietly for years until outside pressure brought it to a full boil. The BRITTNey Griner situation accelerated everything. When Griner was detained in Russia and later returned to the United States in a high-profile prisoner exchange, the story generated enormous media coverage.
It really don't make a difference if you say he or she. To me, like when I'm out in public, like my teammates sometimes will get mad if somebody call me a he, but I'm just like, I don't care. Like, you know, we go sit down and get some food and they're like, sir, what do you want? I'm like, yeah, let me get the steak, medium well. Thank you. I'm in TSA and I'm going through TSA and, you know, the guy pats me down so I could go through. I'm cool. I didn't have people come running like, no, it's a girl. I'm like, hey, you're making it awkward. Yeah. Like, I'm just trying to get through. Whoever could pat me down the fastest, I don't care.
Yeah.
I've had the opposite where someone was like, hey, you know, it's just against the rules. Like, he can't pat you down. Like, she has to pat you down. And then she walks up and she's looking at me. She goes looking at my chest, looking me up and down, looking at my chest, trying to look at the ID. making it awkward, or they'll ask me, "You really a girl?"
But the coverage also pulled Griner's public persona back into sharp focus, including her views on topics that have become deeply controversial in the sports world. And when she began speaking publicly about transgender athlete inclusion, the tension that had been building inside the league finally had a visible face to attach itself to. League executives found themselves in an impossible position. Supporting Griner's stance risked alienating a growing segment of fans who felt that biological fairness in women's sports was being sacrificed for political optics. Opposing her stance risked internal conflict and accusations of abandoning progressive values the league had publicly championed. So they did what organizations in crisis almost always do. They said nothing clear, released statements full of carefully worded corporate language, and hoped the storm would pass. It didn't pass. It got worse. Sports commentators across multiple platforms began calling out what they described as an obvious double standard in how the WNBA handled controversy. When players spoke out in favor of progressive causes, the league amplified their voices. When players like Sophie Cunningham spoke out in defense of biological standards in women's sports, the institutional support was nowhere to be found. Critics pointed to this disparity as evidence that the league wasn't actually interested in open dialogue. It was interested in controlling the narrative, and it was losing that control fast. The panic inside the front office became visible in the league's public communications. Statements became vague, interviews became carefully managed, press access tightened. All the classic signs of an organization trying to limit damage rather than lead through a crisis. And meanwhile, the debate continued to rage in exactly the spaces league executives couldn't control: podcasts, social media, sports talk radio, and the comment sections of every major sports outlet in the country. What nobody inside the league seemed willing to admit was that the crisis had an obvious solution sitting right in front of them, but acknowledging it would have required a kind of institutional honesty that corporate sports organizations almost never managed to produce. And then BRITTNey Griner made it 10 times more complicated. BRITTNey Griner is not a quiet person. She never has been. Standing at 6 feet 9 inches, she commands attention in every room she enters, and she's never shown much interest in softening her views to make other people comfortable. So when the national debate over transgender athletes in women's sports reached a fever pitch, it probably shouldn't have surprised anyone that Griner walked straight into the center of it. In a series of public appearances and interviews, Griner made her position crystal clear.
Everyone deserves the right to play, so she's now weighed in on this. She's got a big voice.
I suppose it's sort of lucky that BRITTNey Griner's not just starting off, because if these are the rules when she was starting off, then the whole thing might be different. The problem we have in America on this is that there's a very distinct lack, actually, of women defending women in the public square on issues like this. And that isn't the case in every other country. And for instance, in my own country of origin, Britain, there have been very, very prominent women, not just in sports, but across the political and social platforms who have objected to precisely.
She believes that every person deserves the right to compete in sports, including transgender athletes competing in women's leagues. She framed it as a matter of basic human dignity and said she intended to use her platform to fight for that principle going forward. The declaration was immediate news, and the reaction was immediate and fierce. Part of what made the story spread so fast was the personal element Griner added. She spoke openly about her own experience with gender presentation, describing moments at airports where TSA agents and staff misidentified her gender and the reactions that followed. She described feeling unbothered by pronoun mix-ups and dismissive of teammates who got upset on her behalf when strangers used the wrong pronouns. Her casual, unfiltered delivery made the clips highly shareable, and they spread everywhere within days. For her supporters, Griner's comments were seen as refreshingly honest and brave. For her critics, they were seen as dangerously disconnected from the reality facing female athletes at every level of competition. And the critics were loud.
A woman decided to stand up for women and female spaces. And that woman is now getting lambasted by other women because she doesn't support transgender people in female spaces. Sophie Cunningham, who many of you will probably know from this video, recently got herself in hot water because she had the audacity to say that women and girls should be protected.
WNBA star Sophie Cunningham, who plays guard for the Indiana Fever, when an ESPN feature quoted her opposition towards biological men competing in women's sports. She said she wanted to protect young girls both on court as well as in the locker room, calling her position kind of common sense. It has everything to do with reality.
Author and cultural commentator Douglas Murray was among the most direct in his response. He argued that Griner's position, despite whatever personal authenticity it carried, represented a serious blow to thousands of young women competing for scholarships, roster spots, and podium finishes across the country. Murray pointed out something that often gets lost in these conversations, that the stakes aren't just professional. At the high school and college level, biological advantages in competition have real, concrete consequences for girls whose athletic futures depend on fair competition. When high-profile athletes publicly advocate for policies that remove those protections, Murray argued, the damage extends far beyond the professional leagues. The response from female athletes was sharp and organized. Veterans of women's sports who had spent decades advocating for equal opportunity in athletics came forward to distance themselves from Griner's position. Tennis legend Martina Navratilova, who has been one of the most consistent voices on this issue, made clear that advocating for transgender inclusion in women's sports without acknowledging biological realities is not a feminist position. It is, in her framing, the opposite of feminism because it prioritizes ideological comfort over the tangible opportunities that female athletes have fought for generations to secure. Two-time Olympian Sharon Davies echoed that sentiment, pointing to documented cases where biological advantages had already produced measurably unfair outcomes in competitive settings. Both women noted that this isn't a fringe concern, it's a widespread reality that has been quietly affecting women's sports for years, while major institutions have chosen to look the other way. What made Griner's timing particularly significant was the context surrounding her own history. Questions that had circulated online for years about her background, physical characteristics, and the circumstances of her Russian detention began resurfacing in comment sections and on independent media platforms. League officials made no effort to address these questions publicly, which for many observers only amplified the speculation. The silence from the WNBA front office on all of this was deafening, and while the league stayed quiet, one of its own players decided she had heard enough.
This jersey used to represent someone I respected as an athlete. Today it represents something I can't support anymore. Sports have the power to bring people together, but when someone uses their platform to demonize or marginalize an already vulnerable community, I have to decide where I stand. I'm burning my support. As a trans woman, I've spent years fighting just to exist authentically.
I will never understand how these people think this is some sort of a win for their side. Like, I am begging you people to be normal. Despite the monumental freakout, Cunningham didn't back down, which we love to see.
Numbers have a way of cutting through noise that emotional arguments sometimes can't. And when sports analysts began pulling together the data on how transgender athlete policies have affected female competitors across all levels of sport, the numbers that emerged were striking enough to stop the conversation cold. Approximately 14,000 female athletes are estimated to have lost competitive opportunities, including podium finishes, ranking positions, and scholarship consideration, as a direct result of competing against biological males in their respective sports. That figure, cited by multiple researchers and athletic advocates, represents real people with real futures at stake. Not abstractions, not political talking points, actual young women whose athletic careers were shaped, limited, or ended by a policy debate that most of them never asked to be part of. Martina Navratilova has been one of the most relentless voices in bringing this data into public conversation. Her credibility on this issue is difficult to dismiss. As one of the greatest athletes in the history of women's tennis, she spent her career fighting for the right of female athletes to compete on equal footing. When she speaks about biological fairness in sport, she does so from a position of lived experience that very few people in the world can match, and her message has been consistent and unambiguous. Allowing biological males to compete in women's categories without restriction isn't inclusion. It's erasure. Sharon Davies brought a similar perspective from her background as an Olympic swimmer. Davies has pointed out that the biological advantages in question aren't subtle. They're measurable, documented, and significant. Male puberty produces changes in lung capacity, bone density, cardiovascular efficiency, and muscle fiber composition that remain present even after hormone therapy in most cases. These aren't opinions. They're physiological facts that sports scientists have studied extensively. The idea that acknowledging these facts is somehow controversial, Davies has argued, reflects how thoroughly the public discourse on this topic has been distorted. The conversation kept coming back to Title IX, the landmark legislation passed in 1972 that prohibited sex-based discrimination in educational programs and activities receiving federal funding. Title IX was specifically designed to create protected spaces for female athletes, recognizing that without those protections, women would consistently be crowded out of opportunities by biological males.
Brittney Griner, the WNBA's Brittney Griner, is in fact a man.
Value, Brittney. Let me see something real quick. Brick, thank you.
Damn.
Look at the chest.
Who hold inherent physiological advantages in most athletic disciplines. Analysts who weighed in on the WNBA debate made the argument clearly. Private organizations can set whatever policies they choose, but institutions receiving taxpayer funding are bound by a different standard, one that was explicitly designed to protect biological females. The Valuetainment panel that broke down this issue in detail didn't pull punches. They walked through the specific biological markers that create competitive disparity, not as abstract science, but as practical athletic reality. A male athlete with superior lung capacity doesn't just win races. That athlete takes a scholarship away from a female competitor who trained for years expecting to compete on a level playing field. That athlete takes a roster spot. That athlete changes the composition of a team in ways that ripple outward through the entire program. What made the panel's breakdown particularly pointed was their observation about media coverage. Legacy sports networks, the same outlets that cover the WNBA extensively, have largely avoided deep analysis of these biological realities. The coverage tends to frame the debate in purely political terms, supporters versus opponents, with the science treated as secondary or even irrelevant. The panel argued that this framing is itself a form of dishonesty, one that serves institutional narratives rather than the female athletes whose careers are directly affected. The financial dimension of all this adds another layer. Competitive scholarships in collegiate athletics represent hundreds of thousands of dollars in educational opportunity. When a biological female athlete loses a scholarship position to a biological male competitor, the loss isn't just emotional, it's financial, academic, and professional. The downstream consequences of that single competitive outcome can redirect the entire trajectory of a young woman's life. All of this data, all of these real-world consequences, was circulating loudly in the public conversation while the WNBA's leadership remained strategically quiet, and one player had seen enough of that silence. Sophie Cunningham didn't set out to become a lightning rod, she set out to play basketball. But in the current climate surrounding the WNBA, simply saying what you believe out loud is enough to turn you into a target overnight, and Cunningham found that out in the most public way possible. When ESPN featured her comments on biological males competing in women's sports, the reaction was swift and predictable. Cunningham had said something that millions of people privately agreed with, but that relatively few public figures in professional sports were willing to say on record. She argued that women and girls deserve protection, not just in competition, but in spaces like locker rooms, where privacy and safety are legitimate concerns regardless of anyone's political affiliation. She called it common sense. Her critics called it something else entirely. The label that stuck most visibly in online discourse was MAGA Barbie, a dismissal designed to frame her position as politically motivated rather than practically grounded. It's a tactic that gets used frequently in these debates, attaching a political identity to a position so that the argument can be dismissed without being addressed on its merits. Cunningham didn't take the bait. She didn't issue an apology. She didn't walk anything back. She stood exactly where she had been standing and let the noise wash over her. That refusal to flinch turned out to be a significant moment. In a sports culture where institutional pressure tends to produce rapid public capitulations, Cunningham's steadiness resonated with a huge segment of fans who were exhausted by watching athletes, coaches, and executives fold under social pressure the moment controversy arrived.
Again, cultural power. This is why the WNBA this is not going to go away. This issue is not going to go away. They're in such a bad position here. Caitlin Clark, they have cultural power. People love them. People are buying tickets that would never care about the WNBA. There's a reason why people call Sophie Cunningham MAGA Barbie, and people are starting to fill the arenas to watch her and Caitlin Clark. She's not apologizing for saying that there should be no men in this woman's sport. It's caused an absolute crisis, and people are losing their mind.
Caitlin Clark is an absolute all-star. She is the Michael Jordan of this. This is the girl that girls have been waiting for forever.
Caitlin Clark is a rising star in women's basketball. She's pulling in crazy viewership numbers.
These women spent $1,000 on tickets to attend the Indiana Fever versus Atlanta Dream game, specifically to see Sophie Cunningham.
The reaction from fans wasn't just supportive in comment sections, it translated into something far more concrete: ticket sales. Reports surfaced that fans were specifically attending Indiana Fever games to see Cunningham and Caitlin Clark, citing their willingness to speak honestly as part of the appeal. The combination of elite basketball and authentic personalities proved to be exactly what a large portion of the fan base had been hungry for. One report noted that fans had spent over $1,000 on tickets to attend a single Fever game, specifically motivated by these players. That's not a casual interest. That's genuine connection between athletes and audiences. The contrast between Cunningham's reception and the institutional response to her comments revealed something important about the gap between WNBA leadership and the actual paying fan base. While executives were carefully navigating political optics, real fans were spending real money to watch athletes who talked to them like adults. The disconnect was hard to miss. Cunningham's situation also sparked a broader conversation about the pressure that professional female athletes face when they deviate from institutional messaging. Players who align with progressive league narratives receive institutional amplification. Their statements get promoted, their media appearances get facilitated, and their voices get treated as representative of the league's values. Players who express views outside that framework often find themselves navigating media hostility with little to no institutional support. The imbalance is obvious to anyone paying attention, and it's created a quiet resentment among athletes who feel that the league's commitment to free expression only extends in one direction. What Cunningham demonstrated, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in this entire controversy, is that the WNBA has a choice. It can continue prioritizing activist messaging over athletic authenticity, and it can watch its genuine fan base slowly disengage. Or it can recognize that fans don't just want wins, they want players who are real, players who say what they mean and stand behind it when things get uncomfortable. Cunningham is doing exactly that, and the crowd's showing up to watch her make the case better than any front office statement ever could. But the deeper you dig into this story, the more questions surface about the very figures at its center. The internet has a long memory, and when a public figure becomes the center of a national controversy, old footage, archived interviews, and dormant speculation tend to resurface fast. That's exactly what happened with Brittney Griner as the WNBA debate exploded into mainstream conversation. Questions that had floated around online forums for years suddenly found a much larger audience, and the league's continued silence on those questions only amplified their reach. Viral investigations on social media platforms began circulating clips and images that drew renewed attention to Griner's physical characteristics, specifically the attributes that critics argued went far beyond typical variation in female biology. These posts accumulated millions of views across multiple platforms, generating comment threads filled with speculation and debate. For the most part, legacy sports media ignored the phenomenon entirely, which in the current information environment tends to have the opposite of its intended effect. When mainstream outlets refuse to address something that millions of people are actively discussing, the discussion doesn't die, it intensifies. The Valuetainment panel, one of the more widely watched sports commentary programs operating outside the traditional media structure, dedicated significant airtime to breaking down the resurfaced footage and the questions it raised. Their analysis was pointed and detailed, walking through specific physical attributes that panelists argued deserved direct acknowledgement rather than institutional deflection. They highlighted what they described as a calculated silence from major sports networks, a pattern of non-coverage that they framed as editorial decision-making in service of a preferred narrative rather than straightforward sports journalism. Part of what made the Griner story so combustible in this context was the backdrop of her Russian detention. Griner spent roughly 10 months in Russian custody after being arrested at a Moscow airport in early 2022, following the discovery of cannabis oil cartridges in her luggage. The subsequent diplomatic negotiations and eventual prisoner exchange generated an enormous volume of media coverage, most of it sympathetic in tone. But critics pointed out that certain aspects of Griner's situation, including specific details about her detention conditions and the nature of the diplomatic discussions that preceded her release, received relatively shallow scrutiny from the same outlets that covered her return extensively. The gap between the volume of coverage and the depth of coverage became a talking point for commentators, who argued that major sports media had effectively placed Griner beyond critical examination.
This thing that he's doing where he's pretending that he's a woman is very smart.
It really don't make a difference if you say he or she to me.
Some psychopath can just pretend that they're a woman and knock women over on the court.
I gotta check this out. Norman's a fucking woman, dude. I bet.
It's a giant dude who's just dominating these chicks. So the more controversy there is, the more people do come to see them. The crazy thing about the WNBA, imagine if the NBA had the same sexual dynamic. Imagine if the most of the team was a bunch of gay dudes who were like very aggressive and
treating any skeptical reporting as inherently motivated by bias rather than legitimate journalistic curiosity. This framing, critics argued, was itself a form of bias, one that protected a specific narrative at the expense of honest reporting. Online communities that had been circulating questions about Griner for years felt vindicated by the mainstream attention the controversy was now receiving. They pointed to archived footage, old interview clips, and side-by-side physical comparisons as evidence that their questions were not frivolous. Mainstream outlets continued to dismiss these discussions without engaging with the specific substance of what was being raised, which only deepened the credibility gap between legacy media and the independent platforms where these conversations were actually taking place. What the Griner situation ultimately illustrated was a structural problem in how major sports media covers athletes who have become politically significant. Once a public figure is associated with a particular ideological cause, critical coverage of that person becomes fraught with institutional risk. Journalists self-censor. Editors redirect. Networks make calculated decisions about which stories serve their audience relationships and which ones create problems they'd rather avoid. The result is a coverage landscape where the athletes and stories that most need rigorous examination often receive the least of it. For WNBA fans trying to make sense of everything happening around the league, the Griner situation left a troubling question hanging in the air. If major institutions aren't willing to address obvious points of public curiosity directly and honestly, what else are they choosing not to say? And how long before that kind of strategic silence starts costing them the audience they're trying to hold on to? The answer to that question was already becoming visible in the arena where it matters most. There is no version of the current WNBA story that makes sense without Caitlin Clark at the center of it. Everything that is happening right now, the inflated ticket prices, the packed arenas, the mainstream media attention, the brand deals, the argument about whether women's basketball can finally sustain genuine commercial relevance, all of it traces directly back to one player from Iowa who changed the entire conversation before she played a single professional minute. Clark's college career was one of the most watched chapters in the history of women's basketball. She broke scoring records that had stood for decades. She turned Big Ten women's basketball games into nationally televised events with ratings that rivaled men's college basketball. She did it with a style of play that was impossible to look away from, deep three-pointers from distances that most professional players wouldn't attempt, court vision that made her teammates better, and a competitive intensity that translated perfectly through a screen. She didn't just attract basketball fans. She attracted people who had never watched women's basketball in their lives and converted them into genuine supporters of the sport. When she entered the WNBA, the effect was immediate and measurable. Indiana Fever games sold out. Secondary market ticket prices spiked to levels the league had never seen before. Television ratings for Fever games broke WNBA records. Sponsors who had shown only passing interest in women's basketball suddenly started paying serious attention. Clark had done something that years of league marketing campaigns and social advocacy initiatives had failed to accomplish. She made the WNBA feel essential. Joe Rogan, in the middle of his broader commentary on the league, made a point that cut through everything else he said. The WNBA had been handed something extraordinary. A generational talent with genuine crossover appeal. A player who could bring millions of new fans into the sport and build something lasting. And rather than protecting and maximizing that opportunity, the people running the league were allowing culture war controversies to consume the spotlight. In his assessment, that's not just a strategic failure, it's organizational malpractice. The contrast between Clark's impact and the league's response to it tells you almost everything you need to know about the institutional priorities currently governing the WNBA. Clark draws fans, Cunningham draws fans. Players who combine athletic excellence with authentic personalities draw fans. These are not complicated observations. They're what the data shows, consistently and clearly, and yet the league's public communications continue to center on ideology rather than on the players who are actually driving engagement. Fans who spent over $1,000 on tickets to watch Clark and Cunningham play aren't showing up because of a social media campaign. They're showing up because those players gave them a reason to care about the sport on its own terms. That's the foundation of every successful sports league in history. Individual players who transcend the institutional framework and create personal connections with audiences that no marketing department could manufacture. Clark is doing that right now, in real time, and the league is surrounding her story with noise that threatens to drown it out. Rogan's broader point about the WNBA's missed opportunity connected to something that sports analysts have been saying for years. Women's basketball at the highest level is genuinely compelling. The skill level is exceptional, the competition is fierce, and the personalities are strong. The sport doesn't need to be propped up by political positioning. It needs to be allowed to be what it actually is. A high-level athletic competition featuring elite performers who have dedicated their lives to their craft. What Clark represents, beyond her individual records and highlights, is proof that women's basketball can stand entirely on its own merits. Fans will show up for talent and authenticity. They will pay significant money for access to something they genuinely love. The league doesn't need to manufacture relevance through controversy. It has relevance. It's just burying it under decisions that prioritize short-term ideological signaling over long-term institutional health. The WNBA is at a crossroads that it may not get to revisit. The window that Clark has opened is real, but windows close. Fans who feel that the sport they came to love is being used as a political vehicle eventually stop showing up. The organizations that figure out how to honor their genuine athletes, protect competitive integrity, and get out of the way of the game itself are the ones that build something lasting. The ones that don't end up with empty arenas and a cautionary tale. Right now, it could go either way. What we're watching unfold around the WNBA isn't just a sports debate. It's a stress test for what professional women's athletics actually stands for. Joe Rogan said out loud what millions were already thinking. BRITTNey Griner staked out a position that directly conflicts with what most female athletes experience in competition. Sophie Cunningham refused to pretend she agreed with something she doesn't believe, and she paid a social price for that honesty that no player should ever have to pay for telling the truth. And Caitlin Clark, sitting at the center of all of it, keeps putting up numbers and filling arenas while the institution around her debates questions that her performance has already answered. The real question this story leaves behind isn't about any individual player or commentator. It's about what kind of institution the WNBA wants to be, because the fans have already voted. They're buying tickets to watch athletes who are real. They're tuning in for skill, authenticity, and competition that means something. That audience exists and it is growing. The only thing standing between the WNBA and its best possible future is whether the people running it are brave enough to choose the sport over the politics. What do you think? Drop it in the comments below.